Hi friends, and welcome to week 2 of this Honest Advent journey. Last week we read from the opening of Matthew's Gospel, the genealogy of Jesus. This week we get to read from the prelude of John's Gospel that begins right at the beginning of the Gospel, verse 1:1. We're going to begin there. We're going to read a few verses and jump down. These words are very likely familiar to you, but I would invite you to try to hear them anew. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. He was in the world, this is now verse 10, but the world came to being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, "This is he of whom I said, the one who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. So way back at the beginning of Common Grace, before we even officially launched, there is one of my very favorite memories, really of Common Grace, but of anything that's happened. So we were just a few weeks from getting ready to launch. We were a church community that wasn't worshiping on Sunday morning. We were a community, though. We were gathering, we were praying, we were excited. We had this vision for what God was doing with us. I was connecting with business leaders in the area around where we would meet at the Ball Conference Center. We had built relationships. We had invited people to come and be a part of this. And then just a few weeks before we were ready to launch, before we even had a worship leader, it was a very tense time, we hosted a community event called Fall Festival. It was our very first one. It was an absolute blast, and it was an opportunity to invite business leaders and folks from the community to come and to celebrate the season, to hear a little bit more about this church, this community that was coming that would be called Common Grace, invite them to come and be a part of it. And so children came in Halloween costumes. We had snacks and all kinds of activities. It was such a good day. In the midst of all of that, there was one little boy who was dressed head to toe in his Spider-Man outfit. I mean, he had the whole getup. His legs and feet were covered. He had the muscles, and he had the mask over top of his head. It was clearly Spider-Man. And so he seemed to be having a good time doing the trunk or treating. And at one point, I think he walked up to my wife, or they sort of interacted with one another. And she said, "Look, it's Spider-Man." And the boy tensed up, and he pulled off his mask, and he began to wail and cry as he said, "I'm Harry Potter." It was one of the funniest things that I have ever seen. I still can't hardly tell it without laughing. There was no costume underneath the costume. It wasn't as if he was Superman who had actually been Clark Kent. No, he just pulled off his mask and said that he was Harry Potter, and he was so distraught that she had not recognized that. Friends, I think in our own ways, many of us do this in our own lives. It may not be quite that comical, it may not be quite that clear, but we put on certain masks, we project certain sort of images, we want to believe certain things about our own identity, so much so that we'll get distraught, we'll get upset, we'll get defensive if other people see through it or don't see things the same way. We invest a lot of energy in projecting a certain kind of image. We put masks on in order to protect ourselves. We do all of this all of the time and sort of pretend to be something that we are not. It's a defense mechanism. And in the midst of this Advent, part of what we're asking, part of what I'm inviting you to, part of what Scott Erickson is inviting you to do is to let down some of our guard. This week, we're going to talk about that specifically around identity. We do this. We put on these masks and these projections in one way or another in all sorts of ways. We hide our true selves, our true identity, the still small part of our own being, our souls. Parker Palmer is one of my favorite authors, and he says the soul is like a wild animal. It's tough, resilient, savvy, and self-sufficient, and yet exceedingly shy. Sometimes I think about our innermost being, our truest identity as a wounded animal. Each of us carries wounds in our lives, and sometimes we are more tenacious, more aggressive with others, the deeper or the fresher the injuries that we experience are. You know, we are people who have injuries. We're people who are worn down and tired. We're people who have been hurt and betrayed. We're people who carry our questions and our doubts. Now, that's not the sum total of who we are. I don't mean to say that. We certainly have strength and power as well. We have a lot of capacity. We are capable. We are creative and loving. We build things. We build relationships. We make our way through healing. We are a sum of all of that, of the good and the bad, of the beautiful and the ugly, of the clear and the murky. All of that is a part of our identity. And sometimes we are honest about that. We put that out to the world. Sometimes we're vulnerable. Other times we put on those masks. We try to hide all of that. Somehow, it seems to me, in the midst of the holiday season, all of that gets magnified. We're tired and worn down, and that can happen especially in the holiday season as we've got the hustle and bustle. We have questions and doubts, and maybe this whole idea of an incarnation of God come to dwell among us, this whole notion of immaculate conception, of this baby being born 2,000 years ago having any impact on the way you and I live today, maybe all of that feels a little bit uncertain. We have our doubts and our questions in this season. Is there indeed goodwill for all? Is reconciliation always possible? I believe this season can also magnify and draw attention to the strengths. We get the invitation for creativity. We get the opportunity to express love in different sorts of ways. We're encouraged in all of the scripture readings and the religious readings and in the society at large to think about what reconciliation and peace and goodwill and restoration looks like. We're invited to name some of our power as we move into a new year. All of this seems to get magnified in the midst of the holidays. In the midst of this holiday this year, together we're on a journey called Honest Advent that's inviting us to be a little bit more real, a little bit more vulnerable, and a little bit more open as we do these 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. We remember that last week we said that a part of the invitation of Advent is to let go of our certainty and enter into a time of waiting, of anticipating, and of wondering, and to allow ourselves to be in that place. We said that vulnerability isn't our strong suit. It's not what we like to do. It's not very natural for us, and yet we know that in the midst of vulnerability, there is the possibility for creativity and restoration and healing and relationship, that there is a lot of good and beautiful things that can only come with true, authentic vulnerability. And yet, even that healing, even that possibility, even that potential sometimes feels scary to us. We know that if we're open and we let our guard down, we might find in the midst of the season that God meets us in some sort of unexpected way this Christmas, that God might be born anew in us in ways that we didn't anticipate. And we know that Jesus takes on all the vulnerability of what it means to be human in order to build relationship with us. The challenge was whether we'd embrace that vulnerability in order that our relationship with Him might grow. In 2 separate chapters of his book, Scott Erickson speaks about the passage that we opened with, our message with, from John's Gospel, from the prelude, the beginning. Speaking about the first section, Erickson zooms into this. He says, "What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." We often talk about Jesus as the light of the world, and we often talk about Christmas as a light shining in the darkness. Erickson says that the Word, or the Christ, or Jesus, gave life to everything and everyone, and that Word's life brought light to everyone. Or the giver of life joins that life and brings all light to all life. It's all confusing, but don't get lost in the metaphor. Here's the point of all of that. He says, put simply, the function of light is to help us see more clearly. Jesus' life helps us see our own lives with more clarity. Do you get that? Jesus is the light because He comes into the world, and in Him, in His message and His living, in the inauguration of a new kingdom, His life allows us to see our life more clearly. That's what light does, and this is something that I can latch onto. I don't know about for you, but for me, in the midst of this particular holiday season, I could use some clarity. I could use some clarity about what's going on in the world and about the future. I could use some clarity about decisions and the direction that things are going. I could use some clarity about relationships and next steps that I could take. I could also use some clarity, if I'm being quite honest, about myself, about who I am, about the places in my life where I am strong and capable, and the places where I feel uncertain. I could use some clarity in my own identity because there is a lot of internal work that I need to do. I don't know about you, but I know I could use some clarity, some light to see things for how they are. Jesus comes that we may see reality, that we may see ourselves more clearly. Then in the latter part of John's prologue that we read earlier, we read again that the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen His glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. I love that. I just want us to pause for a minute to imagine that baby, that child, that infant, as one who is full of grace and truth. Erickson defines truth as the actual state of the matter, seeing things as they are. He goes on to say that the truth is the end of the journey towards having a clear perspective. Truth is found when we can lay aside our own preferences and advantages and see everything the way it is. It's interesting, Erickson says, that people who spent time with Jesus consistently described him as being full of truth, having clear perspective, seeing the real. Now there's a connection between this clarity, this truth, and the idea of light that Jesus brings into the world. His raw assessment of reality. Throughout his life, Jesus would uncover hidden motives, deep divisions, wounds inside of people, and issues that divided people and communities and relationships. He would uncover much that was under the surface. He would see things as they were, and he would look at people and he would see their heart. Not the way that we often see people, but see what was underneath and within our lives and within ourselves. I believe that Jesus invites us to look in a mirror and to see ourselves in the reflection of His life and to find the truth of the matter about who we are. To pause our pretensions and projections and to view, instead of in our entrenched corners, to view ourselves as He sees us, to view ourselves with a higher degree of truth as we see reality for what it really is. You know, as I was preparing this message and writing this, it was actually about this point that I began to get uncomfortable. You see, because when we talk about Jesus as the light, I'm good with that. Jesus comes to provide light so that we can see things for what they really are, to see the world, and I'm good with that. I think we need that. I need that clarity. But then when we see truth, then all of a sudden it's less about seeing what's out there and it's more about seeing what's in here. The truth of who I am, the truth of my identity. That's the focus for this week, is identity. And all of a sudden I begin to say, I'm not really sure that I want to see that. I'm not sure that I want Jesus to see that. I'm not sure that I want Jesus to see all that's broken and the less flattering parts of me. I don't know that I want to confront those. We spend a lot of time putting on those masks, Harry Potter, Spider-Man, putting on those masks, projecting these images because we don't want to deal with those things. And all of a sudden, this very comforting thing about light and then this bit about truth, when I combine those together, it began to make me feel a little bit uneasy. Now we're talking about venturing into true vulnerability. Now I'm feeling a little bit exposed. But there's one other piece that the prologue of John calls our attention to that I want to focus on. There's not only light that's illuminating all that is, and Jesus is not only full of truth, laying bare the actual way things are, Jesus is also full of grace. And grace is the antidote to the anxiety that I just mentioned. Grace is the unmerited and free gift of divine love given to you and I. So all of who I am, all of who I have been, and all of who I will be that I do not yet know, all of that is known by God. And all of it is wrapped in grace. We're drowning in an ocean of grace. there's nothing we can do about it. It's offered to me without cost. Not even when I've confessed all that's wrong with me, not only when I've reckoned with all of it, but even before I know how to ask, before we could do any different, God comes and meets us full of truth and also grace. One more time from Erickson: to see Jesus as full of grace means there wasn't any perfection checklist that we had to meet in order to receive His presence. His arrival stands against the idea that if you do right, you get access to His presence. Instead, Jesus' presence is freely given. He never withheld it. Grace is presence not withheld. I love that. Grace is presence not withheld. Grace is God's presence not withheld. This one who was full of grace has come to dwell among us. Not withholding, but being present and vulnerable and with us. Remember later in John's Gospel, the second part of perhaps that most famous verse in the Scriptures, for God so loved the world. Do you remember how it ends? It speaks about the purpose. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through the Son. In a vulnerable child, helpless as he is, we find light and an endless supply of grace. When we wrestle with our identity, when we're vulnerable, when we're open, what we find is that God meets us in the midst of that God takes on that same vulnerability, and God wraps all of that in the free, unmerited gift of grace. All of that in endless supply, sent for the purpose of healing and salvation. That's what it was in John 3:16, right? Not to condemn the world, but to save the world through Him. All of this for the purpose of healing. The question in this season for us then is, in the incarnation, in the inbreaking of Christ, will we allow that to illuminate our world, our inner self, our inner being? Will we allow it to help us see things for the way they really are, to see the truth? Do we trust the grace enough to go into that work, that internal work, so that we might be transformed? Will we be still enough to receive it? I mentioned earlier Parker Palmer, and he said that the soul is like a wild animal. And he continues that quote by saying this: if you want to see a wild animal, the last thing we should do is go crashing through the woods, shouting for the creature to come out. But if we're willing to walk quietly into the woods and sit silently for an hour or two at the base of a tree, the creature we're waiting for may well emerge, and out of the corner of our eye, we might catch a glimpse of the precious wilderness we seek. That could be an explanation of what Advent is about. As we seek to lay bare a bit of our own soul and trust that the one who is full of truth and grace will meet us, we're invited to sit out in the cold and the silence and wait, and to see if the truth might emerge for us. On the second weekend of Advent, as we talk about identity and we've lit the peace candle, I wonder, what parts of yourself have you seen for what they truly are and made peace with? Maybe that's something that's happened recently in your life. Maybe it's something that happened a long time ago. Maybe you had to do a reckoning of some sort. Where is it that you did the work of seeing who you truly were to make peace with who you were? You know the second question. What parts do you still need to reckon with? What parts might God be inviting you to bring into the light, to see with truth, trusting that all of it will be bathed in grace? What parts of your world, of your life, of your identity need the presence of the saving one to find healing and wholeness and peace? It is in the vulnerability and openness, in an honest assessment of our identity, that we find the possibility for transformation and wholeness that we seek. And that is a part of the invitation we have this Advent. When I think about the Christmas story, I think about a succinct example of what this process could look like. I think about Mary. Here in this woman, really this girl, she receives this information, this news from a messenger of God that her entire world is about to be turned upside down. He tells her not to be afraid and that there is good news, but when she hears it, she fears and she wonders if this is truly good news. I think she also has to wonder if this angel has come to the right address. She wonders if he realizes who it is that he's talking to. She says, "How can this be?" And she wonders that because she knows herself, not only her circumstances and her actions, but she knows who she is. She knows her past and her present. She knows her strengths and her weaknesses. She knows her intellect and her folly. Like you, she knows what it is to be tired and worn down, to have questions and doubts. She also knows her own capacity and her power, her love and creativity. She knows all of it. She knows all of who she is. And so this news, this divine proclamation, this announcement from the angel, because she knows herself and her identity, it all seems a little bit perplexing. But alas, the divine has not made a mistake. The angel did not show up to the wrong address, has not spoken to the wrong person, has not intended this message for someone else and not for her, has not intended this message for someone else and not for you. The light of the world, full of grace and truth, has come. And Mary, in her wisdom, demonstrates for us what it might look like to receive that. Let it be for me as you have said. Friends, when the light comes to you, I hope that you will say the same. Let it be for me as you have said. I want to read this bit from Scott Erickson's book, Honest Advent, and I would invite you to hear this perhaps as an invitation. So it is with you as well, that the divine proclamation will come through very unexpected ways. It very well may be through the ignored and marginalized aspects of your life, the embarrassing, unsuccessful parts, that if you take the time to listen, you'll begin to hear the angelic proclamation, "Do not be afraid, I bring you good news that will be cause for great joy." This year, where in your life does that need to happen? Where is it that you need to hear that there is good news, even in the unexpected places, even in the messier parts? What areas in your internal self, in your reality, do you need to wrestle with? Where are you seeking peace? However, and wherever, and about whatever it is that the divine proclamation shows up, may you say, as Mary did, "Let it be for me as you have said." Amen.